Welcome back to Texas Sawdust, everybody. Today we're making face frames and side panels. Let's get into it.
First thing you got to do here is plane down some lumber if you haven't purchased lumber that's already planed. I've got it all stacked and stickered here. I like to cut my lumber down to size to roughly the length of all my different pieces. You can see here that I've got all my drawings of all my parts stacked with each piece and how I'm going to cut it out. Then I take it over the table saw and start cutting out on the table saw each of the individual pieces. At this point, I've got all my pieces cut to their rough length and everything's cut to width. I take the chance here to mark out any imperfections on any of the ends, since this will be my last chance to get rid of them. I cut everything to be nice and square and then mark out my final length and cut all my pieces to final length here. At this point, make sure that you have your pocket hole jig set up correctly. You're going to have a bad day if something's off and you start putting screws through a side that you don't want them to show up on. Once everything's set up, then it's just time to put pocket holes in everything. Your tops and bottoms won't get pocket holes, but all of your sides and any individual center pieces will get them. Make sure if you're putting any of your pocket holes off center that you pay attention to what side that is and offset them equally on both sides. It was about this time I realized I screwed up and had to recut some of those face frames. They were not wide enough, so back on the table saw and back on the pocket holes.
Let's talk face frames real quick. To me, the most important thing that you can do to ensure that you do not have any gaps in any of your joints when you are assembling these is to make sure that you wait to sand them until after they're assembled. Guarantee if you sand it beforehand, your sander is going to get a little off, you're not going to be perfectly square, and that joint is not going to fit up tightly. There is one exception to that. Mike Farrington actually has a sandy disc that goes in the table saw, and you can set it up so it is perfectly square. You can run all your pieces through and get nice, tight joints. I would love to pick one of those up. It's just on my list, and I haven't done it yet. But in this case, I'm going to assemble them and I'm going to sand them afterwards. Now, for the square ones, they're really easy. You know, you line up the four corners, you're good to go. Any of the ones that have pieces in between, dividers to separate different cabinet areas, that's where things get a little bit more tricky, but there's some things that you can do to cheat your way through that. Right here, I've got some scrap pieces that I've cut. What you're going to want to do is you're going to want to cut these. These are the horizontal ones that I've cut. They are exactly the same length as this piece. When I put this piece in, I'll wait to put this one in. I'll put this piece down here, and I'll put this piece up here. My square will already be assembled, and then all I got to do is butt this up against both of those pieces, and it will be exactly parallel with the side. Same thing goes when I'm ready to assemble this divider. This piece will already be in there. I'll put this piece here, put both of these on the sides, and then bring this down and butt it up. It will be perfectly parallel with the bottom of my face frame. That will ensure that you get everything nice and square.
What I'm doing here is just adding some glue and then getting some clamps to ensure that everything lines up perfectly. I'm using this pocket hole clamp and I put it in both holes and pull it tight, and that ensures that all my joints are pulled nice and tight before I put any screws in the pocket holes. Right here, I'm using the spacers that I talked about to ensure that my centerpiece is perfectly parallel with the sides, and I did the same thing here. And then it's just on to doing the same thing for the rest of the face frames. Once that's done, it's on to everybody's favorite part, sanding. Now that the face frames are done, we're back at the planer, getting some wood ready to make all of the side panels. I've cut everything down to rough length here, and I'm just planing it nice and thin. My side panel center pieces, which is what I'm working on here, are about 1/2 inch thick, and I'm just getting a nice jointed edge on one side so I can take it to the table saw.
Oops.
Once I got that mess cleaned up, it was back over to the table saw to cut them to width. I wanted the grain pattern to be in the center, so I cut a little bit off each side. Then I cut them to length, and here I am cutting all of the rails and stiles for the center panels.
You'll have to forgive the bit of an odd angle that I've got you here, but I think this was the best way to kind of show you what's going on. So currently we are working on the side panels for the upper cabinets. Side panels are made up of 5 pieces. You've got a center panel, you've got 2 stiles, and then you've got 2 rails. I remember the top and the bottom are rails because like a handrail, you can put your hand down on it when it's in the correct orientation. The other 2 are what they are. I don't have a special way to remember those, but stiles and rails. So here I've got a door that I previously made for our guest bathroom, and this goes on the vanity in there. The center panel you can see is rabbited on all 4 sides. Now this center panel is about an 1/8 inch smaller overall than the grooves that are cut in your stiles and in your rails. This slides in there and floats. It's not glued in place because it will expand and move as the wood moves. On the top, you can see the stiles have grooves or mortises that go all the way through from one end all the way to the other. And the rails have tenons that stick out. Those are glued together. You glue your rails and your stiles together, but you leave your center panel floating. What we've got here is our center panel, our stiles, and our rails. What we still need to do is we need to put a rabbet on our center panel. It is cut to size. Our stiles and rails are not cut to size. We need to trim those down, and we need to add the grooves and the tenons for everything, and then we'll be ready to assemble this, and I'll show you how to do that.
Here I'm cutting everything down to final length. You need to make sure that your rails are slightly longer than their final dimension, and that is determined by the router bit set you use on your router table.
Let's talk about the grooves on the 5-piece panel or doors that we're making. How are those cut? You can buy a router bit set like this, that this will cut the top and the bottom, leaving the tenon, and this one will cut the groove, and they're a matched set. They come together, and all it requires is a little bit of setup to make sure you get them at the correct height. Make sure you save some of your cutoffs. That way you can test all your height measurements or all your settings as you're getting set up to cut the final pieces.
At this point, you'll get your router bits. I use a piece of scrap to set everything up and do a test cut. Once I've got my test cut done and I like it, it's on to cutting your final pieces. This is for the grooves. You can use your rails that you cut earlier to get the bit height to the perfect height.
All right, now it's time to start working on our center panels. We got them milled down, planed to thickness and cut to size. What we still need to do is add the rabbets on all 4 sides. I've got a rabbeting bit in the router table, and I've been making some test cuts on a piece that I had milled down to the same thickness as our center panel. If I zoom in here for you, my final test cut has about a 30-second gap in it. That is exactly what you want, because if you remember, our panel is actually an 1/8 inch smaller on all 4 sides. So that means when the panel gets installed, you'll end up with a gap that looks closer to this. And that will give you plenty of room for the panel to move if the wood has any movement. I ran into a bit of an issue here with these center panels. Since I planed, cut, and routed them, they've sat for a few days and they've actually become cupped on me in this direction. I went through a few different things trying to get the cupping out of the wood, but I wasn't really successful. They're not too bad. It's about a 32nd on average, some of them up to a 16th of an inch. My thinking is that once I get them and I sand them down a little bit and then slide them into here, that will help flatten them out. They do flex because it's only about half an inch thick. So I think I'll be all right, but it is something to look out for. If you're taking something from a much thicker piece of wood and planing it down thinner, there is going to be some wood movement there. I think a better process would have been to plane this down to maybe 3/4 or 5/8, run it back through the joiner, and then run it back through the planer again, just to help flatten things out as that stress was being relieved and I was planing it.
You're going to want to make sure that you sand the interior of your rails and stiles and your center panels before assembly. Be sure not to sand where your rails and your stiles are going to meet up because you want that to be a nice tight fit and the sanding will affect that. Here I'm just pointing out the advantages of using a light. You could see the imperfections you might not be able to see if you didn't use a raking light. At this point, I just mark where I need to add glue and add some space balls. You want to make sure that you add something to prevent rattling after you assemble everything. I mark out where I'm going to add glue so that I don't add glue where my center panels are going to be. Here you can see I screwed up and had to flip around my center panel. I had that backwards. But once I got that fixed, at this point it was just getting everything in its final home, adding glue and assembling it. I like to get a rough assembly, make sure to wipe off the excess glue, get it in my clamps and somewhat tighten down, but not completely. And then I'll use a hammer and a spare block of wood to just kind of drive everything so it meets nice and flush before squeezing the clamps nice and tight. Once the glue's dry, pull everything out, and then it's time to sand everything to final length.
I want to talk about something I would change if I was going to do this again. Right here, I've got my face frame flush with the inside of my cabinet. And that's fine, except if there's any imperfection, it's going to show. What would have been better is to actually have my face frame overhang the inside of my cabinet. It would have hidden any imperfections if I'm slightly off on any of my measurements, as well as it would have hidden these little notches where the shelves are. But, you know, things happen and that's the way it's going to go. Well, just so you know, if you drop your face frame from about 3 feet up onto concrete, it'll break.
Luckily, I was able to kind of get everything fixed and clamp back together. After sanding, it should be fine.
At this point, we've got our cabinet frames assembled and our side panels assembled. I've given them a quick wipe down with some mineral spears just so you can kind of see what they'll look like once they get finish on them. This is where we're going to end part 2. Part 3, we're going to pick up with making the doors for these cabinets. I look forward to seeing you there. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and be sure to remember to get out to the shop. Okay. To start working on the sander. Golly. The sander panels. Let's talk face frames. Face frame. We're making face frames. Face frames.